In 1998, I worked as a security guard at a local Christian college. The first night on the job, I was told it was my responsibility to patrol the campus all night, to make sure the main doors were locked, and to ensure that all the lights were off in the chapel, and it was to be locked by 11 p.m. Standard stuff. So, I start out by walking around campus, getting to know a few students and just feel everything out. When 11 p.m. came, I went to the chapel and went to the basement first. Getting to the bottom stairwell door, I realize it won't open. I push on it 4 or 5 times, but the door seems locked. All lights are out and it's secure. I go over to that stairwell door and it opens easily for me from the outside. I figured it was just how the door was made. I go back upstairs and go to the stage where the light switches are at. I look up and I see what looks like a kid in the balcony. I yell for him to come down, but he doesn't answer. I climb the stairs to the balcony, but oddly enough, when I get up there, I can't find him. I get creeped out, but I figure it's late and I'm just seeing shadows. I go back down, cut all the lights and lock up the chapel. At 3 a.m, I go out for the full campus rounds just to check up on everything. Heading across the quad, I notice that the lights are on in the basement of the chapel, as well as the front spotlight. I go to the basement back door and find it still locked. I go in, cut the lights, and as soon as I do, I hear a long, loud bang in the stairwell. I run in there and up the stairs thinking I'm chasing someone, but there's no one anywhere. I go back down and leave the back door and lock it. As I walk around, I notice the spotlight is off. I check to see if it could be motion controlled, but quickly figure out that it was not. Since it was my first night, I decided not to say anything. The second night changed that. I again had weird experiences around the chapel, but on night 2, I also hear weird crying sounds in the woods on the north side of campus. I ran my flashlight through the trees, but saw nothing. Later that night, I see 2 strange hooded teens down on the southwest side near where the tennis courts are. I tried to get close to them, but it always seemed like they were constantly 20 to 30 yards away from me. No matter how fast I moved, I could never catch up. As I keep following them towards the edge of the campus, I hear a student yelling behind me, and I jerk my head towards the sound. When I turn back to look for the hooded figures, they are nowhere in sight. Out of breath, I walk back to the quad and sat down on a bench to collect my thoughts. I lie to myself and decide that everything is normal, and I'm just not used to staying up so late. All my rounds go okay for the next few hours, but at my 3 a.m. walkthrough, I see the lights in the chapel are on again. I check the doors and windows, but they are all securely locked. I unlock the main door and walk through the foyer and hear what sounds like shuffling coming from the stage. I look and don't see anything at first, so I go behind the curtain to make sure no one is backstage. After ensuring it was all clear, I flip all the lights off, and in that split second before everything went dark, I suddenly see a group of dark figures in a circle appear on stage. Then, total darkness. I flip the lights right back on, but once again, no one's there. I just flipped the lights off again, this time without looking, locked the door, and returned to the quad. Thankfully, the rest of the night was quiet. The next shift I worked, I decided to call and ask the guy who hired me and owned the security company about the weirdness. He said that one of the other guards would drop by and basically debrief me. The guard who showed up was a 300 pounds of pure muscle Cherokee beast of a man. I told him everything and he said, "Yep, that sounds about right." He then proceeded to tell me that everyone who worked there overnight had some experience. He said that the stairway doors actually do not lock, but he himself had spent 40 minutes one night locked between floors. He told me that he had thrown all his weight against both doors, but they would not move, and that every time he tried, he would hear this crazy laughter. He said he had chased what he thought were teens through the downstairs hall, just to watch them disappear. That another guard had walked into the chapel and stumbled into what looked like a sacrifice, with occult symbols drawn on the stage, and had chased off people with cloaks, only to find all evidence had disappeared when he came back after trying to catch the cloaked figures. He also said that occult symbols were constantly being found on campus, and that it was my job to gather and dispose of them. I nodded in shock, but felt relieved that I wasn't losing my mind. I continued to have weird experiences on that campus, even though nothing violent ever really happened to me. The atmosphere began to take on an undertone of malevolence. I started to dread every shift. Needless to say, I didn't stay there long. Back in the early 2000s, certain states were in mountain lion frenzy. People were claiming to see them every day. Photos were taken, but they were always obviously just large house cats. These were states that had never been home to mountain lions, or states where mountain lions once lived, but were overhunted or driven away. Supposedly, a mountain lion was spotted at the playground of a school not far from where I lived. My mum didn't really believe in it, but she told me nonetheless to be cautious. One day, me and 3 girls from my neighborhood were climbing up a hill that sat beside our neighborhood. The hill was steep, covered in overgrown weeds and woody plants, and led to a small patch of woods and train tracks that went into a closed-off concrete factory. I used to go up there a lot. The place has a lot of rumors surrounding it, and it's a pretty creepy location, but I never felt threatened. This day was different. I could feel eyes on me the entire climb up. When we reached the top, the air was eerily still. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. For some reason I kept looking at the treetops rather than the ground in front of us. The youngest girl in the group says, "What's that?" I look across the woods to see a cat. But as it started walking closer, did I realize how big it was. The other girls screamed and ran away, which was a stupid move. But my dad made me watch nature documentaries, so even at 10, I knew not to make any sudden movements. This gargantuan mountain lion gets closer and closer to me, and I stay completely still and try not to show fear. After what felt like an eternity, I was face to face, up close and personal with it. I probably shouldn't have, but I locked eyes. I would have fallen in love with its big blue eyes if I hadn't been defecating in my briefs. The mountain lion starts sniffing me. It sniffs my hand, and at one point it pushes its nose up against my palm. This makes me think that it may have been someone's pet. The fur was surprisingly soft, and its nose warm, and if I had known for sure that it had been fully domesticated, I probably would have patted its head. But I didn't. I stood completely still. I guess the mountain lion either didn't think I was very tasty, or just didn't want to get its claws dirty, because it just turned and walked away. When it was gone, I ran home and told my mum what I had seen. I didn't tell her that I had been face to face with it, because I knew she'd lose her mind and call animal control, and I really didn't want them to get to it. That was 2002 to 2003. I don't think there has been another mountain lion scare since. Looking back, it was horrifying, but also a beautiful, once-in-a-lifetime experience. I work night shifts at an airport, cleaning planes for different airlines. I recently got the pass to start cleaning for a second airline. I never had any issues until I started working on these two planes. I clean the same group of planes every night, as they stay at my airport overnight. Well, while working on one of these two planes for Airline 2, I noticed someone walk down the aisle behind me. I thought it was my co-workers leaving me to clean the plane alone. But when I looked around, my co-workers were on the opposite end of the plane still working. This happens every night I work, pretty much. I see people walk behind me, or hear footsteps, and when I look around, there's no one there. Not really a big deal, but it's all I got. Seeing as I don't believe in ghosts, but it's something that's been bothering me. So next time you're on a plane, be careful. It might be haunted. In 1986, my wife and I decided we wanted to go camping on an island. So we loaded all of our camping gear into our boat that was way too small to be on the open water, and went wandering around the coastal islands of southwest Florida. Eventually, we found a nice-looking spot on a small island and set up a campsite. We walked around the island and determined that we were the only people on the whole place. After a nice evening alone on the beach, we settled into our tents and sleeping bags for the night. At about 1 a.m., we were awoken by a scream, but this was no ordinary scream. The sound was inhuman and unbelievably loud just outside the tent. I instantly had goosebumps on top of goosebumps. I really do not have words to describe the scream that awakened us. It was an absolute mind-numbing howl from the pits of hell itself. Perhaps if you were pounding Bigfoot's nuts with a sledgehammer on an anvil, he might make this sound. But it was not just a single scream. In a few seconds, the scream repeated, and something brushed up against the side of the tent, shaking it. My wife and I were terrified. Something was on the island with us, something inhuman, something big, making sounds that caused my heart to stop with each cry. A third time the cry repeated. This time we heard the distinct sound of our camping supplies being scattered and thrown around. I was terrified beyond logical thinking. I was frozen in indecision. I had to know what was out there, so that I could perhaps fight it, but I was too terrified to look out the door of the tent. My imagination was running wild with what unholy terror I would encounter upon unzipping the tent flap. My wife was terrified also, but kept pushing me to look. Finally, after the fourth scream, I could hide under the covers no longer. I slowly extracted myself from my sleeping bag. I moved to a crouched position so that I could spring into a fight quicker. With a camping knife clenched firmly in my right hand, I slowly pulled the zipper of the tent, all the time trying to stay as quiet as possible. Eventually, I nervously pull an opening high enough to place a single eye against the wall of the tent and peek out. I couldn't believe my eyes. The sound that scared us nearly out of our minds were raccoons. A whole group, a herd, a family, whatever you call a bunch of them. They were rummaging through and fighting over our dinner scraps and camping supplies. One of the larger ones had the remains of a crab, a claw firmly attached to its right front paw. And every time this one would scuffle with the other one over some of the scraps, the raccoon with the claw attached to its paw would howl like a banshee. I did not know that a raccoon could make a sound like that. It's unearthly. We spent some time watching them scuffle over our scraps before shooing them away. We later learned that although not the official name of the island we were on, the locals chose to call the island Raccoon Island. The side of the family that raised me is very superstitious, but I generally am not. They have a history of seeing spirits and other unusual things. However, I have never seen anything blatantly paranormal. I went to a quaint little private college. A lot of the dorm buildings are super old and were converted from a convent, a hospital, and a funeral home. Well, I have a few stories. During sophomore year, I lived in the second largest room of the building that used to house a funeral home. I had 2 roommates and the room was huge. Everything was normal for the first few months. Then, my significant other and I broke up, and I walked in on him and my roomie a few days later. I freaked out, and they started to avoid my room as they had started their own relationship. I would wander off to the local graveyard just because it was quiet and I didn't have to deal with people. I crashed there a few times, but it was getting colder, so I was usually home by about 3 a.m. By then, my roomies would be asleep. Well, I would come into the room, walk across the pitch darkness, and without fail the light on my desk by the entrance would come on. This was every night that I came back from the graveyard. My roomies would be asleep. I'd be across the room changing, and the desk light would turn on. This stopped when I stuck a bunch of religious memorabilia around the lamp and stopped hanging out at the graveyard. Well, 2 years later, I'm in my senior year, and I've opted to live in this dorm building again. I've got my own room on the top floor. All is well for the first half of the year. Then I come home from winter break and things get weird. I had pictures and my paintings all over the wall. They are all pretty secure. Well, every day at least one picture falls down, usually loud in the case of paintings, and it would wake me up from my sleep. I eventually stopped putting them back up. Then one night, I awake to glass shattering in my room. I don't own glass things, with the exception of shot glasses that I was using for a design assignment. They sat atop of my closet. I flipped on the lights to do an inspection of the room, and nothing is out of place. Nothing is broken, and the glasses are still where I had left them. In the morning I check again. The glasses are where they are, and I go to class and return in the middle of the day, unlock my door, and the glasses are now sitting in the center of the floor. I get scared. I start to call my significant other before bed every night. On nights that he visits, the paintings don't fall, and I sleep better. I go to bed alone one night, put my laptop underneath my bed, face up and closed. It's the first decent laptop I've ever had, and I'm very protective of it. Again, I wake up to a large smash in the night. I flip on the light switch, and my laptop is upside down on the middle of the floor. A chunk of plastic from inside it is across the room. My laptop no longer works at all. Well, the next day, I flip. I scream all over whatever the hell is breaking my stuff and threaten to have a priest, rabbi, or whatever I can think of come in and expel it. I put paper and pencil on my dresser and make it very clear that if this thing tries to communicate with me through any means that is not directly writing on that piece of paper with that pencil, I will do everything in my power to have it removed. I line the walls and windows and doorways with salt and cover the room in religious stuff. I put my dream catchers up, and everything weird stopped happening. Last year, some months after graduating, I stumbled onto a page listing the hauntings of my college. I wasn't super social outside of my clique, and hadn't known that our school had such a history of hauntings, and that there was an annual lecture by the president about it. Apparently the ex-funeral home was said to be haunted by a little girl who passed away in a fire there. Whoops. One of the RAs mentioned to me that they would wake up to a little girl's voice asking where her bicycle was. So I guess they dealt with the little biddy too. So I have this story. A lady brought her service animal on board. Turns out it was just a pet she had brought a vest for. This dog was completely out of control. He was jumping all over us in the row, barking, growling, snapping at people, and running all over the place. The flight attendant told her she would need to keep the dog in the carrier, and the lady turned into a witch, saying that she had no right to tell her to put her service dog away. Mid-flight, the dog took a dump right on the aisle floor, and it reeked so bad. Her dog had crawled up in my face, and its long nails scratched me through my shirt so hard that I began bleeding. After I got off the plane, I met up with my family and they said, "Oh my god, you smell like a wet dog." And I had to tell them this story of this awful lady and her service dog. I live in rural southern Nevada, a small dust hole town on the Cali border. Anyway, I was in the middle of town by our shopping strip with some friends when we stopped at a bench to smoke a cig. Well, that's when I noticed the bird. Now there are all kinds of birds that walk, yes, walk, around the parking lot looking for food. Mostly pigeons and a few crows. This bird wasn't one of those. It was a tiny jet black bird with yellow eyes. It looked old as hell and was very scruffy, missing patches of feathers, bald neck, and just hopping along near some other birds. I pointed him out to my buddies. "Look at that ugly bird." And as soon as I said it, the bird stopped, turned around and looked at me. With my first-hand knowledge of freaky paranormal stuff out in the desert, this made me uneasy, so I continued, "Nah, he's not ugly. Looks like he's been through some stuff. Probably a badass bird." And I kid you not, the bird nodded and went back to hopping down the sidewalk. Now, I've seen this same bird twice in that part of town, always chilling in the back of whatever posse birds he's not following. Not sure if this is legit or not, but there was something different about that bird. I attended a year at a very small, not well-known school. I lived in the dorms for a semester. In the dorms, the doors only locked from the inside, and the hallway lights were on a motion sensor after 10 p.m. to save power. My roommate and I were in our room with the doors locked, and I was sitting at my desk writing a paper last minute, with only my laptop screen for light, because my roommate was trying to sleep. I was proofreading my paper at around 2:15 a.m. and closed my eyes for what I perceived as a second, to give them a rest, and when I opened them up, my computer screensaver had blacked out as it was set for 15 minutes. In the dark, I heard my roommate thrashing in his bed and gasping into his pillow. It sounded like he needed air, so I said out loud, "Hey Mark, you okay?" And as soon as I said it, I heard him gasp like he had just come up for air from a swimming pool. As I said this, I bumped my mouse and the screen came on. The next two events happened so fast that for the longest time I wasn't sure of the order of things. Our door slammed open, even though it had been locked, and I heard footsteps run down the hallway to the right. These things happened almost immediately after I spoke and the screen came on. I opened the door to see who it was, and though I had still heard footsteps in the hall lights were off. Nothing had tripped the motion sensors, and only came on as I stuck my head out of the door, and the guy across the hall asked who had slammed the door and was running, and I had no answer for them. When I turned back into the room, Mark asked me why I thought it would be funny to hold his pillow over his face and try and suffocate him. Again, I had no answer. I explained things as I remember them to Mark, and he got the chills. We both asked to be transferred to another dorm room. This happened in Thailand in 2014. I had lost my job in Zurich and decided to use the opportunity to make a trip around the world, starting with Southeast Asia. I have always wanted to work with animals, so after backpacking Vietnam and parts of Thailand, I applied for a volunteer position at an ape sanctuary. They told me I could start whenever I wanted. The deal was that I had to make a deposit of around 20,000 baht, which nowadays translates to a little bit more than $500. They told me that if I stayed at least 3 months, I would get 70% of my money back. The early days of working there were wonderful. The place was full of young, motivated people who thought they could save the world one ape at a time. The majority of the animals were rescued gibbons. Our goal was to nurse them back to health and eventually release them back into the wild. Our responsibilities as volunteers were to feed them, clean their cages, and educate visiting tourists about the horrors of the illegal pet trade in Thailand. Before they came to us, most of the gibbons had been abused as tourist attractions. You know, those pictures you see on Facebook from people being on vacation somewhere in Asia, where they hold cute animals into the camera? This is how the poachers make their money. They will put a gibbon, lizard, or slow loris on your shoulder, snap a picture, and charge you for it afterwards. I can tell you that every single one of those animals had been through hell, and was destined to a short life after those pictures had been taken. The thing is, poachers can only use the babies as tourist attractions, because as soon as they reach puberty, they become territorial and aggressive, and are no longer of use to them. On average, to get a single baby, the poachers has to end the life of 15 other gibbons. This is because they are still attached to their mothers at that age, and the poachers will shoot her first. Then they will shoot the father because he will be trying to protect them. In most cases, the baby won't survive the fall from the trees, so the poacher have to end the lives of a few extra families until one survives. Then the real pain begins. They have their fangs ripped out without anesthetics so they can't bite. They will be drugged so they stay awake during the night when the tourists roam the street. They will be chained so they cannot escape. They will be kept in tiny cages, fed the wrong food, and some will be taught to drink alcohol or even smoke. And as soon as they are no longer of use, they will be left to perish. The poachers will then go on and find the next. As you can imagine, most of the gibbons in that sanctuary had been pretty traumatized, but still, working with them was fascinating. They all had their own personalities, including little quirks, preferences, and biases. Most of them were shy. Some only tolerated men near them. Some disliked girls with blonde hair. One female took a particular liking to me. Every time I walked by her cage, she would start playing with herself furiously. Her boyfriend, who was kept in the same cage, did not seem to care at all. I spent my days cutting fruit, mixing cement, hosing poop down the drain, and getting eaten alive by the mosquitoes. Even though it was hard labor without any real pay, it was probably one of the best times of my whole trip. We all felt like we were doing something selfless, something noble. It was a truly fulfilling experience. Then one day, I was scheduled to work in the quarantine area. This is the place that tourists never get to see. It's where they keep the really bad cases, the gibbons that had been damaged beyond hope. They told me some of the things that had been done to them. Unspeakable horrors. All of them were either too sick, too weak, or too aggressive to ever be released back into the wild again. To be blunt, most of them were insane. First there was Ninny. She was hyperactive and showed self-mutilating behaviors. You always had to feed her first. If she saw you give food to a different cage before hers, she would flip out, rip out her hot water container, and throw herself down to the floor and start biting at her own arms. She was also kind of mean. The other volunteers had warned me that she would try to startle me. She would hide in a dark corner of her cage or act as if she were busy or sleeping. But as soon as you turned your back to her, she would jump at the bars right behind you with this ear-piercing scream and rattle the fence. I have dropped more than one food basket in this manner, and after a few times of that happening, I got sick of it. I filled my mouth with water and walked closely by her cage, facing away, far enough that she could not reach me if she stuck her arm through the wire. As soon as I heard her move, I instantly turned around and spat the water at her. I did not hit her, as gibbons have lightning-fast reflexes, but she never tried to scare me again after that. Then there was one who literally looked and behaved like a zombie. His name was Fanta. He had been blinded by an infection in both eyes. They were white and foggy. Big chunks of his fur had fallen out, giving him a very decrepit appearance. He never swung and only moved by slowly walking along the branches of his cage. You had to rattle his food basket during feeding time so that he would know when to come out and eat. Another one was called Pam. She was special. They never told me what had happened to her, but she was missing one foot, one hand, and all but 2 fingers on her other hand. You had to cut up her food into really small pieces, because she had a hard time eating. She was already old for a gibbon, and very calm, yet there was something out of the ordinary in her eyes, something intelligent. She was the only gibbon we were allowed to touch. We had to, because we needed to apply cream and powder to her stump. She hated the powder though, and would only allow it if she got a little massage first. Like all the gibbons in this area, she was alone in her cage. I guess she just missed being groomed by a partner. A Thai worker told me the story about how some years ago, a volunteer who was going to clean her water container found it empty. That was unusual for Pam, because with only 2 fingers, she wasn't really able to drink that fast. He turned the container upside down just to be sure, when a dark green scorpion fell out and crawled away. There were a few more apes in the quarantine area whose names I've already forgotten, but there is one I'll never forget. Burrow. Burrow was huge for a gibbon, and strong. If he managed to get a hold of your shirt, he could pull you up to the cage and rip it right off your body in a single pull. Same thing was true for tufts of hair. While most gibbons get really excited during feeding time, Burrow was different. The first time I approached his cage, he didn't even come down to see what kind of food he would be getting. I could already hear him chewing on something up in his cage. Black feathers were floating down from his branch. He had somehow managed to catch a bird, and Burrow was one of the few gibbons who still had his fangs, and there was something wrong with his lungs. He was the only one you could actually hear breathing, and when he sang, which he did not do often, it had this weird rattling tone to it. Oh, and he was also infected with hepatitis, and since he liked to throw his poo around, his hands were sometimes covered in feces. You better make sure he'd not scratch you. They'd tried to find a girlfriend for him a few times, but it never worked out. It seemed like he just hated other gibbons, and for some reason, he really hated me. They had told me that Burrow was not fond of new volunteers, but with me, it was on a different level. For example, we used a water hose to clean the cages from feces. The water pressure had to be quite high because after some time in the sun, the poo would become dry and really stick to the bars of the cage. Gibbons don't like to get wet. That's why most of them hide in one of the top corners while we did the cleaning. During those few minutes, I felt like I was in charge. I did not have to constantly cover my back. One mistake did not mean a new scratch or a urine stain, but to Burrow, the hose meant nothing. Whenever I came close to his cage, he instantly tried to rip it from my hand. He didn't even care if he got soaked. He just cared about catching me or taking something away from me. Whenever I worked in quarantine, I could feel his stare. Whatever I did, he was watching me. Every single time I came close, he tried to grab me. He would hide in the shadows of his little house or behind some branches, then jump at the fence and reach through it. His claws were always exactly at face level, sometimes just a few inches away, grasping desperately. The tie keepers told me they had never seen behavior like that. One day, a huge spider web had appeared overnight between a tree and the next cage over, blocking my usual path. I'm not a fan of spiders, and I was behind schedule, so instead of removing it, I tried to go around it. It meant I had to be a little closer to Burrow's cage than usual. I thought it was still far enough, but it wasn't. I tried to squeeze past the tree with my back to his cage. He caught the collar of my shirt. I was lucky that I was already holding onto the tree, otherwise he would have pulled me to the cage. I heard him hiss behind me as I managed to pull away, my shirt tearing, and me falling face first into the web. I took a little walk afterwards to calm myself down. When I returned, he was sitting in the shadows of his house again, breathing this slow, rattling breath. That was the last night I ever saw him. The next thing I am about to tell you, I did not see with my own eyes, but the keepers told us a few days later at lunch. That morning, when the keepers and some volunteers arrived at the quarantine, they felt like there was something wrong. Gibbons usually sing, especially in the early hours of the day. You can hear them from miles away if they give it their all. But this morning it was quiet. The first thing they noticed when they entered the area was a huge red puddle under Fanta's cage. What was left of him was hanging in the feeding area. They found parts of him in his food basket outside his cage and on the ground. The second thing they noticed was that Borrow's cage was empty. What had happened was that the part where his little house was screwed to the back of the cage had rusted, and combining its weight with his strength, he managed to rip it out and squeeze himself through the hole it left. Fortunately, none of the other gibbons were hurt. It was partly my fault that he had escaped. The volunteers were supposed to check the integrity of the cages at least once a week. The tool we used for that was a long stick with a metal hook on top. It should have been used to pull at the rusty part of the grid to see if it would still hold. But that type of work was a pain. The tool was heavy, and the gibbons would always go crazy and grab it. You had to go places in the area that were hard to reach, so almost nobody cared to do it properly. The team they had to catch gibbons was one guy with a blowtube. He was actually a great guy. He taught us how to cook rice in bamboo and could climb a tree in seconds, but he was also an alcoholic. Almost every night, he would down a bottle of sang som and then try to find a way into the women's bungalow. Nobody really had any hopes of catching Borrow again, unless he would return to his cage by himself, which some gibbons before him actually did. From the moment they told me that Borrow had escaped, working in this sanctuary became quite stressful for me. I always imagined him watching me from the trees outside. They went looking for him in the forest, but there was no trace. Not even once we heard him singing in the distance. Still, every time a branch snapped somewhere behind the trees, I twitched. During the next week, we heard that some tourists had been attacked by a wild gibbon. They went out into the forest and looked for the culprit, but nothing came of it. The following night, I was awakened by a familiar sound. At first, I thought it was my roommate snoring. Then I realized it came from the window, which had no glass, only a mosquito net. A slow, rattling breath. It was Borrow. It was pitch black, but I'm sure it was him. He was holding his breath every couple of seconds, as if he wanted to be quiet so he could listen for something. I just lay there trying not to make any sounds. I thought about what I was going to do if he decided to come inside. My plan was to use my blanket to shield my body. My roommate would surely help me. After a few more moments, the rattling breath stopped one more time. It never resumed, and he was gone. The next day I told our boss that I was leaving. It was not only because of Borrow. Some of the other people that I really liked were leaving too, and I just felt like my time there was over. There were many more places in the world I wanted to see, and I'm sure they were able to afford a few new cages with the money I left them. So I did not feel bad about my decision. I don't know if Borrow ever returned to the sanctuary. When I think about it now, I just feel sorry for him. He was not evil, just a wild animal that had experienced more terrors than most of us can ever imagine. My wife works as an air hostess, and this story was relayed to me from her after one of her more eventful flights. As many of you probably know, turbulence is an ordinary part of the flying experience, and air hosts are trained to know that it is not dangerous in most cases. A woman boards the plane with my wife. She could already tell that this lady was irritable, or at the very least, not comfortable flying. It was only a 4-hour flight, and my wife makes a mental note to try and be extra nice to her when interacting. The moment that the flight takes off, the woman is hammering at the little button on the airplane, trying to get the air hostess's attention. So, my wife, once the plane is in a safe position in the sky, goes over and starts speaking to her. The woman has really red eyes, and my wife instantly thinks that she's taken some kind of substance, but is unsure what. She starts looking up at my wife, stroking her arm gently, and saying, "Dearie, you need to get me off this thing. I think I'm gonna lose my mind." And then, without provocation, does she start shaking in her seat, her arms and legs flailing, smacking the seat in front, and shouting very loudly. This upsets numerous passengers, especially those next to her, and she carries on going with her fit. After a few minutes of my wife trying to calm her down, offering her water and such, does she finally stop, and my wife has to move her to first class to get her away from the other passengers. She sits there and does the same thing. At least this time, there was no one around to be bothered, at least not directly next to her. My wife is then tasked by the head stewardess to look after her for the entirety of the flight because she was being so chaotic. This went on every few minutes. My wife says it was horrifying to watch. She wanted to call an ambulance when they were arriving, but the woman said that it was normal for her to have episodes on flights as she is so afraid of the sky. Well, it was an interesting experience to say the least. In July 2003, my friend John and I went on an overnight trip to Spray Park, a flowery alpine area on the northwest flank of Mount Rainier. We went for the wildflowers, the glaciers, and the beautiful landscape. Little did I know it would bring me face to face with mortal danger. The hike was wonderful. Clear skies and pleasant temperatures made the strenuous ascent a little easier. We passed up through the tree line, past waterfalls and alpine glory. Eventually, we broke through the trees and found ourselves on the glaciated flanks of Mount Rainier. We were lucky to find a perfect campsite adjoining the glacier. We had a clear, flat area and access to water. We spent the evening shooting photos, playing songs on our kalimbas, and watching the golden hour of sunset pass over the top of the world. The night went by without incident, but John was taken ill. He caught some kind of nasty cold. The next morning, he put down some coffee and biscuits, but informed me had no energy to continue up the mountain. The exact elevation at that point is 8,364 feet, and I thought it would be a really cool idea to climb up there and see if my fancy new altimeter wristwatch was really accurate. I would have to do it alone. My plan was to head straight out of the camp, then hug the glaciated area along the base of Echo Rock. I would then follow the gently rising slope in the upper center to reach Observation Rock. I wanted to hug Echo Rock because the ascent was easier and the shadowed area had firmer snow on it, so up I went. Once I got to the shadowed area at the base of Echo Rock, they appeared. A herd of mountain goats appeared over the scree above Observation Rock and headed right towards me. They were marching straight to me. Like most city folk, I wasn't sure what the protocol was for dealing with mountain goats in the wild. Do you run? Do you puff out your chest and make noise? Do you climb a tree? I had no idea, so I just kept my mouth shut and hoped they walked past me. They did not. They crossed the glacier and moved just above me. The alpha goat was regarding me with disdain. It was at this point things got really weird. The alpha goat bellowed to his flock, "Follow me, we will destroy the intruder." Of course, this was all in goat. And so began the onslaught. This enormous beast sidled past me and climbed up the scree above me on Echo Rock. At first I thought they would simply climb up and away from me, but I was wrong. Once the entire herd had mounted the scree, they started kicking rocks down onto me. I had to sidestep to duck and leap like running back. Huge rocks bounced up all around me, many nearly clipping my head. I had nowhere to run. I backed off, but that's where the rocks seemed to be landing. If I stayed forwards, they mostly bounced over my head, and besides, I was afraid the whole herd would rush me if I ran. Most of the goats, about 15 of them, were kicking rocks down at me, but the baby mountain goat refused to engage in the cruelty. I continually moved below the baby goat because it was the safest place to be. Then one of the goats ambled over to the baby and started headbutting it and bleating loudly at it. He was saying, "Kick rocks at the human or consequences. They will be severe." To my horror, the baby goat complied and kicked a few small rocks at me. The rotten turncoat. The cavalcade of scree started to slow down. I had evaded their reign of terror. The goats now knew I was made of sterner stuff than they had expected. As the rock attack abated, I got off one more angry goat photo and began to back away slowly. To my relief, the herd dismounted the scree just above me and started back up the glacier, curving out around Echo Rock. I took some very long breaths that morning as the goats gave up and headed back up the glacier. I didn't know it, but far below, my friend John was watching the whole thing from his telescope lens. He was prepared to mount up and haul me off if I had gotten beamed by a big rock. I was in good shape back in '03, and my 20-mile-a-week jogging habit had served me well. The 5 aspects of fitness: strength, endurance, speed, balance, and flexibility. You need all 5 in times like these. After they were gone, they of course went in search for a weaker human, and I took a few minutes to collect myself. I was uninjured, but I was still a bit shaky. I sat down on a rock and looked across the glacier. Just ahead was Observation Rock. The whole point was to climb up the rock, and I wasn't about to turn around now. I decided to get my act together and scamper up. The hike across the glacier and then up the rock was uneventful, but once I reached the top, I found I was not alone. Fergal and Tim, who were touring the North Cascades, had been up there for quite some time. They offered me hot tea and snacks, which I greedily consumed. I didn't mention anything about the recent incident. Instead, I mentioned my cool new altimeter watch. I needed to see the plaque and see if the numbers matched. We jumped over to the plaque, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that my watch was only off by about 10 feet. My sea level calibrations had proved accurate. We all sat down and quietly enjoyed the day when Fergal finally mentioned, with typical Irish understatement, "Better goat trouble back there, eh?" "Yeah," I smiled. Then we all broke up laughing. They had watched the whole thing from Observation Rock. Apparently, I looked like a real fool jumping and ducking and sidestepping the goat rock attack. Yeah, laugh it up. It's different when it's your ass on the line against enraged baby goats. The boys and I loaded up. They were heading around the west of the mountain and I was heading down. They took a picture of me and we parted ways. John was glad to see me back at camp. I told him everything that happened, and I think he found the whole thing adventurous, and he was sorry that he couldn't be there. But I put his mind at ease and assured him it was much uncooler than it looked and sounded. We broke camp and headed back down to civilization. In the end, adventure can be sought, but sometimes it can be thrust upon you. Be ready. My good friend and I hadn't seen each other in a few weeks, so we decided to go out to the arcade bar downstairs to hang out and catch up. She picks me up, we get to the bar and order our drinks, and then station up at Tetris. Now, a little bit of additional context, because in hindsight, I feel like it could have been a bit important to consider. We are both female, in our 20s, and aren't exactly the most subtle or modest when we're together. We aren't rowdy or chaotic, but we joke about a lot, laugh loudly, and are usually desperate to impress. We were having a good time dancing along to the music as we played games, and just really sort of stood out a bit from the more casual atmosphere of most patrons. We had arrived around 9:30 to 10 and ended up staying until about 12:40 a.m. The arcade bar closes at 1 a.m, so we finished our drinks, played one last game, and then decided to drive to another bar for the remaining 2 hours before everything closed at 3 a.m. Driving under the influence is very dumb, I know. We had only a couple of light drinks though, and we weren't planning to go crazy. We live in a good-sized college town, but due to the weather being a little rainy and cold, there weren't a ton of people out and about on the streets as we walked back to her car, which was on the opposite end of the block, but still on the same stretch of road as the bar. Once we get in, we sit in the car for a few minutes, talking about various things. She was trying to pull up music on her phone, but the app was having connectivity issues, so it was taking much longer than it should have. In that time, a large white van pulls up and parks directly beside us. I remember pointing out when it parked next to us because it was huge. She drives a 2018 Jeep Wrangler, and this van's windows were on par or taller than our windows. It was pretty much the stereotypical creeper van, but I remember thinking it looked really nice, new, and shiny. At that point though, nothing was out of the ordinary, and we continued on talking and fiddling with the radio for another 5 or so minutes. Eventually, we give up on the music and start backing out of the parking space to head to the other bar. Coincidentally, the van starts up as well and backs out of their parking space just as we drive off. We never saw anyone get out of the van, so it seemed strange that they were suddenly now just leaving after having just parked next to us 10 or so minutes ago. Now, being 2 young women at the bar scene in a college town, we are always on the lookout. We are immediately suspicious of this van when we notice it behind us, but we write it off initially as a coincidence. To explain this setup a bit, our downtown is designed with essentially all north to south streets being alternating one-ways, with a few exceptions, and nearly all east to west streets being two-ways. Sometimes to get to a certain place, you're basically forced to take certain routes because of the one-ways. To get to the next bar, we turned left onto a one-way south, and then left again to go east on a two-way. At the very end of that street, about 5 blocks, was our destination. The van followed us the entire way at this point, and we were certain that it was not just a coincidence. We're trying to be hopeful that maybe they're just going to a bar as well, but my friend later recalled they never used any turn signals while behind us, and made sure to keep a close distance. There is a small parking lot behind the bar, and because of the one-way street next to it, There is literally only one route you can take to get to it. So we turned right onto the street, drive about 40 feet, and then immediately turn into the parking lot. Because of the bar itself, the parking lot isn't visible from the two-way street that we initially turned off, meaning the van wouldn't have been able to see us go into the parking lot until after they cleared the intersection. The parking lot is also a sort of C shape, with one strict entrance and one strict exit. So if you miss the entrance, you technically would have to drive all the way around the block again. Thankfully, there was another car at that intersection that got between us, so we had more time to hide in the parking lot and see if the van would also come around the corner. My friend immediately turned the Jeep's lights off. Funnily enough, we actually parked right next to another Jeep Wrangler, and we watched. Sure enough, within a few seconds, the van made its appearance, but did not turn into the parking lot, and instead drove past it. However, this is why knowing about the one-ways is important. Because of the way the streets are set up, there would have only been two logical reasons why they would have turned after us on that one-way street. A. They were indeed going to a bar as well, and were going to park in this parking lot, or the one next to it. It's 1 AM, so all nearby restaurants are closed. Or B. They were going to continue straight down that road and go into the residential areas to go home. They did neither of these things, and instead turned right back towards the main downtown area, which heavily suggested that they were heading back to loop around the block again, because they potentially saw us in the parking lot, but it was too late and had missed the turn. After that, we were on high alert. We abandoned our bar plans and immediately hightailed it out of there while they were heading around the block. We took routes that were not the main or the most obvious ones, but still in populated areas, so we had as much of a chance of losing them as possible. Thankfully, we never saw them again after that point. For the entire duration of all of this, my first thought was that it was an undercover cop trying to catch us with a DUI, because I was buzzed and paranoid. Maybe they saw us leave the bar and get into our car and decided to follow us. Afterwards though, as my friend and I were talking about it, that seems unlikely. Why would they follow us for nearly 6 blocks and never attempt to pull us over? Wouldn't they flip on their lights once we started driving, or whenever the other cars were getting between us and the intersection? It just feels more sinister than that. I'm extremely thankful that we noticed them immediately, and we never got out the car at that second bar to allow them to catch us up. So creepy strangers, let's not meet again. Me and about 3 of my friends recently went to a fishing hole we discovered on a private gated golf course. To get to the water, you had to park about 1/4 of a mile away from the spot in the maintenance section parking lot and walk in this pitch black dirt path. The parking lot itself is poorly lit by 2 dim street lights, and visibility is almost non-existent. It's close to the main road, and we all planned to go one night. Then I misjudged how fast I could get there, and arrived 10 minutes before anyone else. I pulled into the lot behind the dumpster and got my backpack on and grabbed my rod out of my trunk. I had never gone alone, and there is a lot of wildlife in the area, so I was already pretty cautious. I was prepping to walk the path when I heard lip smacking somewhat loudly, like human lip smacking. I froze in absolute terror, as I imagined the worst. The noise stopped periodically, and the smacking would resume again after a few seconds. I yelled out to whatever was there, not really worried about the golf course greenkeeper finding me and getting me in trouble. I heard what sounded like someone banging on the dumpster really loud, and the smacking stopped. I began to walk the path, and about halfway through it started again. I quickened my pace and ignored the sound. I didn't have a flashlight with me, but my friends did, and they showed up at the spot they told me that they had heard the same sound. They lit up the path with their lights and saw a pair of coyotes, one of which was missing part of its jaw. Looking back, it was terrifying to hear that I was being followed by coyotes, but I'm sure if I were better at explaining this, it would come across as more scary. Another short moment of horror was when we were fishing in this same spot on a separate occasion. There's a heavily wooded area near the pond, and it's important to know that this spot is in Southern California. We were fishing in the dead of night and heard what sounded like banshee screams from Mass Effect. 2 of us had knives, so we weren't particularly worried about it, but it did give us the willies. Apparently there are mountain lions in those woods who travel between the nearby lake, nature preserve and golf course. I wonder how many other times we've been stalked by dangerous animals. What really made us book it though, was when the security rolled out of golf carts to investigate the noise. I am a woman from California. I am not a traveller. I can't drive more than a few hours before my legs cramp up. And the train? I'm terrified. Flying-wise, I've been on a plane a few times to Ohio, and the last time we flew back home, they cancelled the flight, and it was during Hurricane Fran when my son was 7. Fast forward to several years, and my son is in boot camp in Kentucky. We are invited to share his graduation from boot camp, and did I mention it's in Kentucky? My husband and I decided to fly back for our only child's graduation from boot camp, and I was really looking forward to seeing all the things he had been doing, so we booked a flight. The flight was beautiful. I was still nervous, but seeing my son graduate was worth a few butterflies in my stomach. He took us through Fort Knox, the army base, not the gold storage building, and we got to see where he had his various exercises. We had a wonderful visit, although because I am a native Californian, Kentucky was quite a culture shock. We toured Killian and saw some interesting things around the state. My favourite part was going into Subway, the sandwich place, and asking for avocado on my sandwich, and them giving me a very confused look and asking, "What's avocado?" The graduation was beautiful, and all of the young soldiers looked so handsome. We flew home, which was very nice, and I was beginning to think that I could be a flyer. My son was sent to Fort Hood for his AIT training. That's training for his specific job. He was a tanker, and he loved Fort Hood. They had a graduation that my husband and I flew back for, and the flight went off without a hitch. We toured a small part of Texas around the base and saw some interesting sights. At least they knew what an avocado was. And when my son's time for our visit was up, we had to fly back home. I was actually looking forward to the flight home, and I was just slightly apprehensive. We said our goodbyes, and we were on our way to the airport. We boarded a nice big jet, and our flight took us from Fort Hood in Texas right past Ontario, where we needed to go, and straight to LAX, smack dab in the middle of Los Angeles, which is one city I have an extreme fear of. Our flight from Texas to LAX was uneventful and nice. Wow, I'm a flyer. I can travel and go anywhere. This is very exciting for me because I haven't been able to do much because of my fears. And now it changes. Or does it? LAX was the usual chaotic place, but we arrived on time and without incident. We went to check in for our next flight to Ontario, which we could drive to. Our flight to ONT was changed several times for reasons I can't remember. We finally get a flight and proceeded to the gate to wait. They finally called for boarding, and I was expecting the usual first-class passengers can board now, them rows 1 through 10, etc. They just called for all passengers can board now instead, and there was something my husband was not telling me as we began towards the doors that led to the plane. And as I was walking to said door, I looked onto the tarmac and didn't see the elevated platform that they used to walk us to the big jets. We were going straight onto the tarmac. I stopped at the door to outside, and my legs decided they did not want to walk any longer, and I grabbed the door frame in order not to fall. I looked like a stubborn child holding onto this door frame so as not to go to the bathroom to take a bath. Now picture an overweight, exhausted woman doing the same thing but at an airport. The people inside looked like dominoes all running into each other, so my husband just pushed. As my husband pushes me out onto the tarmac and all the way up the stairs leading to this little propeller plane that maybe held 10 to 20 people. As I'm pushed all the way up the stairs, every step feels like I'm walking through water. We get to the top, and I'm being led to my seat by a flight attendant. I can't move. The flight attendant looks at me and says, "Come on," as my husband pushes me, and I decide to sit in the first seat I see, which is right next to a gentleman that I can't remember. He graciously gives up his seat to my speechless husband so that he can sit next to me, which turns out was fortunate for him that he moved. I can't breathe, I can't talk, I can't even swallow any water from the water bottle that my husband magically pulls out of his backpack before putting the backpack somewhere I can't remember. As we take off, the flight attendant buckles into a seat facing the passengers and looks calm, so I don't worry. When we boarded the plane, I noticed it was slightly windy, which I wasn't worried about. As we take off, I lose it. As it's so windy, we have to fly out in the opposite direction of the wind, which is towards the ocean. My biggest fear is flying over water. As soon as the plane turns around over the water, it's just over there long enough for me to lose control. As we ascend, I notice a slight bouncing feeling, and it gets much worse. We hit cruising altitude, and it feels like a ping-pong ball in a dryer. As I'm holding my water bottle, still unable to drink any, we bounce all over the sky. My husband keeps telling me to calm down, and that it's a smooth flight and that we're almost there. The flight attendant never even left her seat, and kept her eyes on me as we fly. I tried to hold my breath, but that only lasts so long. I look out the window and I'm shaking so badly that my husband closes the window screen. I was sure the plane was going to crash, and I picture the news coverage. A passenger plane was brought down due to the Santa Ana winds, news at 11. We are landing, and I can't breathe, and I'm sure it's the end. Why couldn't I perish before we got on the plane? We land in Ontario, and that was that. I was ruined. As my feet hit the tarmac, I told my husband that I would never fly again, and that if he tried to get me on a plane, I'd wring his neck. My son is no longer in the army, and is graduating from college this weekend, and thankfully it's local. My husband decided that next year we might take a cruise. It leaves from Washington, so I'd better start walking now. The scary part is that it's a 7-day cruise to Alaska. I get severely seasick, and we're going to be on a boat in the middle of the ocean for 7 days. I get sick on the Balboa Ferry, which is a 300-foot journey. Sometimes I think my husband doesn't want me around anymore. Growing up, my family, mother, father, half-sister and I, lived in a run-down, low-income neighborhood in my small hometown. Our street was small. As you drive down the neighborhood, there was an apartment building to your right, then 2 houses on the left, one of which we lived in. and the forest began at the end of the stretch. It seemed like all the people who lived on our street had some kind of substance abuse or domestic violence issue going on. Anywho, I was around 5. I'm female, and my sister was around 8. We had a big black Labrador / Newfoundland mix, Riley, who was a huge, sweet goober. Let us paint his toenails, tie up his hair in a ponytail, and was always very tolerant of us kids and as affectionate as could be. He loved all of our family and friends, and he was always friendly and happily curious of strangers. So, one day, a new neighbor we had called Pete was on our lawn speaking to my dad. He had just moved into the apartment, and he was on the top floor. He had apparently got to grade school with my dad, and they were catching up. I remember playing with my sister in the backyard, and my mum came out to tell us, "Daddy wants you to meet a friend." So with Riley trailing behind, we walked through our house to the front door, and stood in the front doorway blocking Riley from getting there, as he had a habit of escaping to get lost and play in the woods. Pete was very pale, a little overweight, and had insanely light blue eyes with heavy eye bags. He wore a flannel and skull cap daily. Just some really strange looking guy, but was not that out of the ordinary for our neighborhood at all. As my dad was introducing us to Pete, we heard Riley growling behind us. Riley had never growled at anyone before. He'd only ever growled at raccoons in the backyard. So it was really weird. Next, I remember he pushed his way past us. Riley, the huge sweetie who'd never bit any of us, even accidentally during play, lunged at Pete. My dad caught him by the collar before he got there. He chalked it up to Riley having stranger danger, even if that's nothing that we'd seen him do in the past. Riley continued to growl and glare at Pete for the rest of their conversation, which was cut short by Riley lunging again. Pete then told my parents that they should have him checked for rabies. Yeah. Once Pete moved in, when Riley was outside, he would get intermittently barked and snarled at, something he had never done before or after Pete. Riley did this until we finally moved. So anyway, during that conversation on the lawn, my dad learnt that Pete had a daughter who he shared custody with the mother, yet we only saw her sparingly, as she was dropped off and picked up. She was in our age group, but she never played with us or the rest of the kids in our neighborhood. Ever. We never saw her in school, as I imagine she went to the elementary school the next town over, because her mum apparently lived there. So we never interacted with her at all. It was just really strange vibes. We hypothesized about why she was seemingly not allowed to play with us for years, until we realized that we hadn't seen her in a long time, so she obviously wasn't having visits with Pete anymore. So around 8 years after this incident on the lawn, I was 13ish. My parents had split up, my father retained custody of my sister, and my mum and I moved to a neighbouring town within the county. Through the grapevine, my mum had learned something that explained Riley's behaviour towards Pete, and she explained that she wanted to tell me about it before I heard this anywhere else. It was always a thing within our family that Riley freaked out like that because it was too out of character for him, and my mum always had weird vibes from Pete anyway. Pete had been sexually assaulting his daughter. He was also physically abusing her, keeping her confined to her bedroom and not allowing her to leave the apartment even to accompany him somewhere. 8 years after Pete had moved in, his daughter had finally found the courage to open up about this after years of abuse. Apparently before, when we had noticed we hadn't seen her come and go in weeks, she had told her mum that he was only physically abusive, and thus they stopped splitting custody and he wasn't allowed to see her anymore after a brief stint in jail. He scared her into silence. The story was later backed up by a cop friend of my mum's confirming it. So Riley's instincts were spot on. He lived to be 13 and continued to be loyal, sweet, big old baby that he was. He never encountered anyone else who provoked a growl or lunge from him ever again in his life. He really was a good boy. Last year, I was working a shift as a library tutor. My job is to workshop people's essays and help them improve their writing. It's normally pretty rewarding, and you get to know interesting people. Until I met this guy. The most uncomfortable I've ever been was some dude hitting on me, or this really religious girl trying to convert me during our session. I can deal with that stuff. This dude was next level creepy. I don't believe in psychic impressions, so when I say this dude gave off bad vibes, what I mean is his minute body language must have been sending off my subconscious mind a lot of massive red flags straight off the bat. Maybe he did just emit evil psychic mojo. In any case, as soon as he sat down, I was uneasy about his presence immediately. He looked totally normal, kind of handsome, very average, and he had this dead-eyed look that made way too much eye contact. He sat in an off-kilter position, with one side facing away from me, his head not looking directly towards me. I tried to be super friendly and accommodating, thinking maybe he just seemed off to me because he was autistic or perhaps had Asperger's, since I did have a lot of autistic friends who also struggled with body language and eye contact. The whole time we spoke, he had this weird little side smile, like he was amused by something I didn't know about. I read through his essay, and the uneasiness in the pit of my stomach grew. It was total nonsense, absolute psychotic nonsense. It was like reading Time Cube. The grammar was terrible, spelling was bad, opinions would be inserted at inappropriate moments, and the logic was super tangential and inconsistent. Still trying to be helpful, I asked him to go through sentence by sentence with me and talk through his ideas. We went through and painstakingly changed each sentence to attempt to thread some semblance of logic throughout the thing. It was only by, like, the third paragraph of this mess, reading it the second time through, that I finally figured out what this essay was about. It was a book report on a piece of pro-Nazi fiction. He'd been given a write about any book you want assignment, and the text he chose was this pro-Nazi book about this heroic Nazi soldier being oppressed after the war for his ideals and actions. It was absolutely Nazi propaganda, and this dude was high-key praising it for 3 nonsensical pages. I was now feeling extremely uneasy. I fall into quite a few demographics that the Nazis wanted to eradicate, and this dude had been making me feel unsafe and uncomfortable without even doing anything so far. So I was walking on eggshells for the rest of the session. I helped him edit his essay and polish his little thesis. I think if I had any foresight, I'd have intentionally sabotaged his paper on principle, but in that moment, I was way too skeeved out to think a plan through like that, and I just wanted him to leave. When he did finally leave, I noticed his backpack had a lot of patches with guns and other military imagery. That also creeped me out. I have friends who love big guns, and they're super chill, but in this context it unsettled me even more. There had been something about his voice, the way he spoke, and his word choice that made me feel uneasy as well. He spoke a little slowly, without much emotion, and had a slight lift to his speech that I recognized but couldn't place. I thought I'd heard his voice before, but I didn't know where. The next day, I realized that his speech patterns had sounded so familiar because I listened to the Sword and Scale podcast, which frequently has interrogation tapes, court tapes, and interviews with murderers. I like to research serial killers and true crime as a hobby, and this dude had the same speech patterns, cadence, and other emotionless delivery as the convicted serial killer's recordings. I hadn't even realized that serial killers had commonalities in their speech patterns until that moment. This dude spoke like one who'd been in an interrogation room. Maybe I was overreacting, but I do believe that our brains are good at picking up on red flags, and this guy set off all my alarms. I've never had such a strong, irrational gut reaction to someone I've only just met. And never again have I had it. When he walked away, I remember thinking, I hope he doesn't shoot up the campus. He gave off the distinct impression of someone who would do something like that. I had to go take a bath when I got home to feel like I was clean. That's how skeevy this guy was. I forgot about him until today, because I've been watching videos about Elliot Rogers and Andrew Blaze, and both of them reminded me of this guy a lot. I hope he dropped out and never came back. While in the military, my unit had an exercise. We had to fly a few hours away. Apparently, my unit rented a big plane and had some Air Force pilots fly it. My assumption is those pilots never flew those big planes, so they wanted to see what it could do. When we took off, it felt like a space rocket as we went straight up. They then turned the plane like they were dodging missiles. Finally, we were on course to our destination, so I thought everything would go smoothly from that point. Nope. I fell asleep and woke up feeling like I was in freefall. I was terrified. I looked across the aisle and saw one of my officers looking back at me with that, "Oh my god, this is the end," kind of look on his face. Everyone else was still asleep. I guess these pilots decided they wanted to see how many engines they could turn off, because I began noticing the sound of engines powering on and off. Life lesson: do not allow an Air Force fighter pilot to pilot a large civilian plane. It will not be a comfortable flight. We have a family pup. His name is Houndoom. He's over a 1.5 years old. He's a Doberman. He's the sweetest and most playful little guy you'll ever know. He loves people young and old and is a great guard dog. His bed is in the kitchen next to the window, and we have a baby gate up to make sure he stays there when guests come in. He always barks when he sees strangers, but once we let him know they're family or friends, he turns into a big baby. Now that I've let you know about my dog, on to the story. I have an 8-year-old daughter called Maddie. She's your average 8-year-old kid. Really nice, loves stuffed animals, never seen a scary movie before, totally innocent. Her best friend is called Sarah. They're the same age and go to the same school. Her parents reached out to us on setting up play dates so they can hang out outside of learning time, and we're cool with it. Sarah has been to our house a few times. The first time she came over, Houndoom went ballistic. Now, like I said earlier, when it comes to strangers, he's barking like crazy. That is until we let him know they're good people. Well, whenever she came inside, he almost broke down the gate. I've never seen him this out of control before. My husband and I were trying to calm him down, and Sarah just stood there staring at him. She had a little smirk on her face. After trying to get Houndoom to relax, I gave up and told the girls to go upstairs. It was weird, but I brushed it off. He probably smelled other dog on her or something, I thought. The next few times Sarah came over to play with Maddie, it looked like he wanted to attack her. That thing that freaked me out happened Sunday. Sarah and her mum walked up to the house and my dog immediately went crazy. He even started growling, which only happens when he encounters other animals. Her mum didn't talk much, which I thought was weird, but I tried not to dwell on it. This time, I wanted Sarah to pet him. I know I'm crazy. I just figured he needed to get close enough to smell her and perhaps he'd calm down. I asked Sarah to come close, and she was looking at him in a very weird way, almost like she was teasing him. She wasn't afraid either, kind of like she knew why he was so livid. She brought her hand closer to him, and as we were petting him and calming him down, he growled and tried to bite her. He didn't because I moved her hand out the way, and after that resumed the barking like he wanted to rough her up. I told them to go back upstairs, and I turned to my husband like, does that not strike you as odd? The way my dog looked at her and barked at her made me feel so ugly. It's like he sensed something from her. My dog is normal, and he'd never acted that way before. He's perfectly fine with other strangers we introduce him to though. I haven't been able to sleep that great, because I keep thinking about how creeped out I feel around Sarah. I highly doubt I'll ever let her come over again. I moved out on my own for the first time, about 2 hours away from my parents in order to go to college. The year in question is 2012. Within the first few weeks of being there, a random guy stopped me on campus and asked me out. I am a very shy, very introverted person. This had never happened to me before. I said yes. We exchanged numbers and went our separate ways. At the time, I didn't have a cell phone. I only had a Skype number, so I made sure to explain that to him. However, he would still call me all day while I was at school, and I had no access to my Skype number while I was there, which I told him, and it honestly kind of put me off. Several days later, I needed to run errands, so I walked to Walmart a good 2 miles from my apartment, bought what I needed, and began walking back. It started to rain, and I thought, wow, it's just gonna be one of those days, huh? About a mile into my walk home, a car slowed down beside me. It was him. He asked me if I wanted a ride. I was naive, sore, and tired, and I got into the car without even thinking of the possible consequences. He made a big to-do about how he wasn't from that part of town, and how lucky I was he ran into me while he happened to be doing errands there. He drove me to my place and asked if I wanted to go to lunch and a movie with him after I put my stuff up. I said sure, why not? He did seem really friendly. Once I got back in the car, things started to get weird. He asked me if I liked seafood. I said no, I really dislike it. He said, well, that doesn't matter. I'm taking you to a really nice seafood place. I'm sure they'll have something you can manage to like. For me, this was my first red flag. Why would you completely dismiss what I'm saying? That means my opinion doesn't matter? However, I come from a very narcissistic home, so I thought that perhaps I was reading too much into it. He started asking me about my major, my friends, my hobby, all the normal stuff. Once we get to the restaurant and sat down, he gave me the weirdest look and started asking if anything I had said was true. What? Are these people you're talking about real? Do they actually exist? Yeah, they're real people in my class. I don't believe you. These people don't sound real. I don't know what not to believe. It weirded me out to be outright accused of making up my friends like that. He went on to accuse me of lying about every detail about my life, Still, little old southern polite me kept a straight face and got through lunch, but it certainly was bizarre. We went to the movie, and he kept trying to touch me the entire time. I was already so put off from the earlier things that I didn't reciprocate. He got aggravated by this and brought it up once that we were out in the car, about how he expected me to be more friendly. No. He takes me home, and I was glad to have that date behind me. I thought it was over. I refused to return his calls and I avoided him at school. Everything is done, right? Of course not. He started showing up to my apartment daily, 8:30 on the dot, to bang on my front door for 30 minutes straight. He wouldn't even take a single minute break. If I answered, he would ask if I wanted to go to lunch later in the day with him. I always told him that I was busy. If I didn't answer, he would just continue the knocking. I didn't have a car, and I walked everywhere, and I started noticing him driving past me several times when I'd walk places. He kept offering me rides, to which I'd say no, thank you, and he also kept calling me daily. This went on for about 2 months. All in all, I'd say I'm lucky it never escalated beyond this, and that it stopped after the 2 months. However, it was scary as hell at the time. I had been visiting my high school sweetheart's family in town, as I live out in said countryside. Her sister and aunt had been very vividly describing the myth of the Lechuza, a human-sized owl spirit, and their related scary stories of the times spent in rural South Texas. It had been a great night, entertaining a romantic skeptic like me on some good old-fashioned spooksies. I kissed my girlfriend goodnight and began driving the 10 miles home in my dad's handy Jeep. Midway, I notice a full moon, just like in the stories. Spooky. I exit the interstate and immediately enter the watch for deer territory as I trek the last couple of miles home. I got to the base of the hill which hides my house from view, with half a mile to go, and then I'm practically home. And bam, there's an owl standing in the middle of the road blocking my lane. In all of my 17 years of living out there, I had never seen an owl, only heard them. The Lechuza might as well have been standing in front of me. Not human, but large. I had to literally slow down to a mere 5 miles per hour before I was allowed to pass, almost as if to say, yes, this was meant for you to see. And I went home, told my mum, messaged my girlfriend, and thought about it all night long. Probably missed my Hogwarts invite. I was flying home from Aruba on a family vacation as a kid. It was a fairly smooth flight on a 747. All of a sudden, we heard the engine spin up big time, and the plane dives, like super steep dives, and you can hear and feel the acceleration. Naturally, people are screaming and freaking the hell out, and after no more of 10 to 20 seconds, but that actually felt endless, we level off and the engines decelerate. Then the pilot comes up on the intercom with something along the lines of, "Sorry about that, folks, there was an inbound other country 747 on the same altitude as us, and we couldn't get communication confirmation, so we had to execute an emergency dive to prevent a collision." Fun times. I was standing in front of my house with my dad on a spring day. This is when I was 7. We were looking across the street at the neighbor's house, making casual conversation to pass the time. Suddenly, we see about 3 crows start to circle around the house. Then one of the crows dives into our neighbor's backyard and starts to pull apart their storm drain. the waterspout that catches roof water and sends it to the ground. It appeared that the family of finches had built a nest in the drain, and the crows wanted to eat the eggs. They succeeded, but that was not all. The crows then caught one of the finches, ripped its head off and started to eat it. The other finch darted off in a fright, abandoning its home. About 3 minutes later, I kid you not, the finch returns with about 50 other finches, and they start to attack the crows. The crows took down a few more finches, but they were covered in a massive swarm of angry feathers. 2 of the crows were ripped to shreds within minutes, and the other one got away, but fell to the ground after making it to a nearby hill, probably due to a damaged wing. It was very scary for my young mind, and I had just seen the horror movie, The Birds. After everything was done, my dad turns to me and says, "What the hell?" This story is one of my brief friendship with a guy that didn't stop following me, and I'm sharing it for closure. I started my freshman year of college at a university in a hometown that's pretty nice. I'm not going to share too much about it, but it has a smaller amount of students, but enough so that you wouldn't run into people often. I lived on campus and was only 17 at the time. I had Tinder, of course, as I was fresh out of a relationship and looking to experience new things in college. I matched with this one boy, Asher, who seemed nice enough. Pretty socially awkward, but I never really minded because I have anxiety issues myself and I'm really sympathetic to it. Because of that, I ignored a lot of warning signs I shouldn't have. We texted for a while and he seemed really nice and caring. He wanted to know a lot about me, which I wasn't too keen on sharing, but I told him the basics and we texted regularly. He lived on campus as well and invited me to hang out. At that time, things didn't seem too sketchy, so I was completely down. When I first met him, that's when things began to get uncomfortable. We hung out in his dorm, which was pretty standard overall. I got cozy with him on his couch, and I'd say almost cuddling, but not quite. Still really standard. When we started talking more, I realized how uncomfortable things really were. He kept making comments that just put me off, but I tried to ignore them. Things like, "I've never cuddled with anyone before. Sorry if I'm doing it wrong." And so many comments about how he already liked me a lot and wanted me to stay forever. Weird word choice, but whatever. He's just trying to be nice. I'll let him down easy. I ended that hanging out pretty quickly for some fake excuse and went right back to my room. He kept texting me and professing how much he was into me, and I told him, "Sorry, but I'm not looking for any kind of relationship, so I do not want to keep things romantic." A bad lie, but I'm a very non-confrontational person and did not want to be mean. That's when things started to get really weird. He sent me this long paragraph saying about how it was okay if I didn't want a relationship now, and that he'd wait for me and save his virginity for me. We had never talked about anything like that. I'd never even really told him that I liked him or flirted back. I just never turned him down. It was one of the creepiest messages I've ever received. Unfortunately, that was just the start of all the weird things to come. He wouldn't leave me alone even though I kept trying to de-escalate things, and I kept running into him all over campus. I wasn't sure how he suddenly was nearby when my classes ended, and I wasn't sure why we'd both be in the dining hall at the same time, even though I hadn't changed my regular routine, but I just tried to brush it off, which was definitely a mistake. I ended up turning him down completely because I was getting creeped out and couldn't figure out how he wasn't understanding that I didn't want anything romantic with him at all. He started guilt-tripping me, telling me how he was going to end himself and that no one was ever going to love him. I had been in manipulative relationships in the past, and I recognized that behavior right off the bat and shut it down. I told him I couldn't be friends with him, and in my head, that was that. He didn't reply for a while, but when he did, all hell broke loose. I was luckily out of town at the time for a concert, so that made me feel a lot better. He went off, sent me paragraph after paragraph about how horrible of a person I was and how I needed to get put into my place. I could handle that. I just ignored it. Then, once the regret set in, he made it his mission to win my love however possible. He apologized profusely, told me how he couldn't be with me all alone, and how I was his only friend and how much he loved me. Whatever. Terrible, but I didn't care about that. Then I guess to prove his dedication, he did the creepiest thing yet. First, he told me that he was outside my room, and we did not live in the same dorm building, so I don't know who let him in. I wasn't there, my roommate was out, so that was okay. And you can't actually get in the buildings unless you live there. I messaged him back at that point and told him to leave, and how wrong and creepy that was, and he pulled out his last resort. He just sent me screenshots of my contacts in his phone. On Apple devices, you can fill in tons of information and have a notes section. Everything was entirely full. He knew my home address, my room number on campus, my parents' and brothers' names, my pets' names, and my schedule. It was terrifying because I'm a fairly private person. My Instagram is my only social media, and I do not share that much on it. I don't think I'll ever find out how he discovered all of that about me. I blocked him on everything right away and reported him to the school. The school, of course, did nothing at all. I still see him on campus, and he still tries to approach me when I see him. I always duck and run, and it's worked so far. To the terrifying Tinder match, who may still be following me around, let's not meet. I was flying from Vegas to Stockton. Mistake number 1, Stockton. And right at takeoff, the plane started shaking violently. I admit this can be normal, but the pilot somehow turned on the intercom and was shouting, "Whoa, whoa," like he was terrified, which in turn made me terrified. I literally started to cry. I thought this was the end. For the first time in my life, I had never until that moment actually felt like I could perish. They turned off the intercom pretty quickly, and after the longest minute of my life, the plane stopped shaking and I silently wept for the rest of the 30-minute flight. They never addressed what happened. They never reassured anyone. They just pretended like it didn't happen. Now, I am no novice to air travel. I have flown all over the world and have even felt a little jittery about flying in the past. But I can honestly say that I don't know if I can ever be so casual about flying again. I went camping with 4 friends a few years ago, and we were indulging one of our friends who is an avid bird watcher. So we were in an isolated valley just past the Blue Mountains in New South Wales, so he could find this owl. We were camping in a town that had a really interesting history. It used to be a booming coal mining town, but has since receded hugely, and is now only as a double-digit population. There is a huge amount of rusty mining equipment everywhere. It's a really cool place. We explored the bush around our campsite a bit, and saw some creepy-looking abandoned caravans, and decided not to get any closer. Anyway, we were going out driving at night looking for this owl. We see nothing, and go back to chat around the campfire. As we're doing this, we all kind of go quiet at the same time, and we hear what sounds like the distant screams of a teenage girl. Now we've literally seen no people in the town at this point. We don't know where the closest payphone is, and we have no reception. We all kind of look awkwardly at each other and then try to play it off, hoping that we weren't the only ones to hear it. Then it happens again, but louder, and again, and again. Now there's no denying it. There are screams coming from the bush, roughly from where the caravans were. We don't know what to do. We don't want to venture into the bush at night and possibly get lost, or worse. We don't have a phone to call anybody, and we haven't seen anybody to tell. So what do? We go into our tents, clutch our knives and try and sleep. When we wake up, Mr. Birdman informs us he did some reading in his bird Bible, and apparently the owl that he was there to see has a mating call that is described as a blood-curdling scream. It was the owl. We don't know for sure if that's what we heard, but I really hope we just heard an owl and nothing more sinister. In 2010, I was a second-year student nurse, studying in a university. My two friends and I decided to have some McDonald's after class. Around 8 p.m. before we split up, one of my friends said that she needed to pee. So we went to the nearest building outside the university extension of a hospital because it was getting late and we wanted to go home as soon as possible. It was the laboratory building, where all the medical students had their classes, with all the taxidermies, real bones on display, chemicals and creepy stuff for normal people. And oh, the morgue with freshly delivered corpses were there too. A guard was standing at the entrance, and since we were in our uniforms and had IDs, he just let us in. As we were walking through the long hallway, with elegant paintings on either side of the walls, one of my friends started to sing. Well, because she loved to, and maybe because it was eerie quiet and it echoed. We were fooling around and laughing and talking nonsense at the top of our lungs. Maybe we mutually found it satisfying to hear our voices echoed, and because we knew that there were no more classes at this time, we were sure we weren't disturbing anybody. At the end of the hallway, there was this long, marbled, curved grand staircase leading to a dim-lighted second floor. It was all fun, and that's when we reached the second floor, and we were all flabbergasted. I know we were not scared, but just really puzzled. There was this girl wearing a lab gown, standing, inches away from the wall, slightly bowed down. She was facing between the corner of this giant post and a wall. At first I thought she was just using her phone, but then I noticed both of her arms were hanging freely, either at her side. Her waist-long black hair draping both sides of her face was curly and dripping wet. We didn't do anything, we just slowly passed her. We calculated our steps to make no noise as we did so, and I don't know if my friends were looking at her as we were walking sideways slowly, but I did. I intently gazed at her, but she didn't react, did not even move or glance at us, but just stood there. When we reached the restroom, none of us talked about it. We were not even talking about anything. I don't know what they were thinking about, but it was just strange. After we'd done our business, we passed by the same route, and she wasn't there anymore. Then I noticed she was standing a few feet away from the morgue earlier. The first door after reaching the top of the staircase was the morgue. Unclaimed bodies of prisoners were the corpses donated there. Until now, my two friends never talked about that incident. I don't know if they totally forgot, or chose to forget. For context, I'm terrified of planes. In 6th grade, my school invited me and some friends for a trip to another state. The thing is, we had to go by plane. The trip was great, but the day we were supposed to return there was a giant storm going on. The plane took off regardless, And let me tell you, kid me almost had a stroke. Not only was it shaking a lot, people weren't calm. Everyone was basically going insane and ready to give up on life. To make matters worse, for some unknown reason, we had to go back. I thought it's because we were going to perish in the storm. We returned to the airport and I phoned my family and started crying so much that I basically wanted someone to go over to that state by car to pick me up, and it's a 5-day ride. Later we found out that a piece of ice hit the pilot's window, cracking it, making us return to the airport. I was terrified, and that left a scar on my mind. Now, whenever I enter a plane, I remind myself of what happened. Thankfully, on the day after, and not being able to sleep in the hotel because I was too scared, the 2 flights we had to take went fine, and I returned home safely. This is probably one of the most nerve-wracking things I've ever experienced while camping. It happened to me while I was in the Boy Scouts. My troop had hiked for an entire day into the mountains, following an incredibly old and vague hunting trail. After at least 6 hours of hiking, we finally get close to our spot, which to be fair was an incredibly beautiful valley tucked in the Rockies with a gentle crystal clear river, maybe 1/4 of a mile wide but only a few inches deep. But about a mile before we reaching the stopping point, we started seeing skulls. To be fair, they were all deer or elk, but still, seeing at least 24 skulls scattered around the area, some strung up in trees in various states of decomposition, is not a pretty picture. So as nervous as the other scouts and I and a few other of the adults were, we forged on, collected a few racks of antlers and made it to the camp. After making camp, setting up and cooking dinner, we all had pretty much forgotten about the skulls. So it starts getting dark, we clean up for the night and get into our tents, and eventually everyone falls asleep, except for me. I've always suffered from insomnia, so I usually stay up late and read, especially whilst camping, so I was the first to hear the screaming. It was a bone-chilling scream, the likes of which I've never heard before or since. I knew to the depths of my soul it was a mountain lion, and not only had we probably camped right on his feeding grounds, but it also saw our camp and wasn't pleased. Can't get any worse, right? Wrong. By this time everyone had woken up, and all the scoutmasters yelled at us to stay in our tents, when all of a sudden we heard another one start screaming as well, also on the other side of the river. There's nothing as terrifying as hearing that screaming, knowing how close these extremely dangerous and most likely angry predators were, but not being able to see them for whatever reason. They never crossed the river, but they kept on screaming off and on until dawn. After getting out of our tents and having a quick breakfast, we packed up in record time and left. I still have the antlers I grabbed as we marched sitting on my dresser at home. This happened in college. My sophomore year, I was living in the dorms and was assigned a random roommate. He seemed a little bit introverted but fairly normal at first, but he wouldn't really talk to me. I would try to start conversations about things he showed interest in, but he would only give me one-word answers that were obviously meant to end the conversation. I figured he probably just didn't like me, so I decided to give him some space and leave him alone. After a few days it started. I would notice that he would always be looking in my direction. I chalked it up to coincidence, but it kept happening. Classes started up, and I spent less and less time in the room, but whatever. I was there and he would be constantly looking in my direction. When I would turn to face him, he would turn his head away, but it would creep me out since it was pretty much constant. I started noticing he would lay on his bed to read, and would hold the book or papers at angles that always gave him a direct line of sight to me. About a week or so into the semester, my girlfriend at the time and I went on a morning hike and crashed on my bed at around 2 p.m. We woke up to him just standing there, staring at us about 2 hours later. He didn't say anything, just turned and left the room. At that point, I decided I needed to leave before he ended me in my sleep and ate my face, and I was out of there pretty quickly. I even told him within the first few days to please stop staring at me, and he outright denied doing it. Fortunately though, I didn't see him again for quite a while, but we ended up having a class together senior year. I'd been telling my friends the story ever since it happened, and they didn't believe me. One of my friends had really poor vision, so we sat in the front row. Of course, every time I looked behind me, my old roommate would be staring directly at me. Not at the teacher, but at me. It didn't matter if we were in the middle or one of the sides. I challenged them to look back a single time during the semester and catch him not looking with me. Within 5 classes they gave up and agreed that he was staring at me non-stop, and he was super creepy. My parents think he was in love with me, but I think his motives were far more sinister. I went camping with a friend of mine one 4th of July weekend. We were just friends, as she had a boyfriend, so she slept in her car with her dog, as she wasn't a huge fan of sleeping in tents, and I slept in the tent. My night goes fine. I sleep pretty well. The front of my tent was facing her car, and the rear of my tent was facing the woods. In the morning, as the sun was rising, I hear footsteps out the back side of my tent and feel and hear fur rubbing up against it. It's amazing how much you can hear in the middle of the woods, away from roads and cities. Unfortunately, the back of my tent was facing west, so there were no shadows. I figured, oh, she probably let her dog out and he wants in. So I opened the front of my tent towards her car, and my stomach dropped. In her car I see her dog, a black Labrador, staring outside the window with paws on the dashboard growling, with his hair standing on end. So many things ran through my mind at once. Oh man, what the hell was behind me? I don't want to get eaten. So I just sat there staring at the dog, who was staring at whatever is behind me. It was one of those moments where everything goes silent and all you hear is your heartbeat. You feel it in your hands and you strain your ears to try and hear what you think is going to eat you. Eventually I built up the courage to clear my throat loudly, and I think whatever it was fled. I never knew what it was, but it scared the hell out of me. A few minutes later, my friend let the dog out of the car, and I grabbed it so it didn't chase whatever was behind me. The dog just wanted a cuddle anyway. I did have my firearm and bear spray, but it's not like I was going to leave my tent to apply it to whatever massive animal was behind it. And no, there was no food inside the tent, as we had sensibly left it in the cars. I was riding on a plane home, and the woman in front of me started snoring loudly. As it was a night flight and me being a light sleeper, this was pretty annoying. But I just sat there with my headphones in, trying to fall asleep to this podcast I was listening to, when all of a sudden, my ears perk up in a moment of silence. The woman is muttering. I pause my podcast and listen to see what she's babbling about, and it goes something like this. "We had to do it, Derek. We had to. They couldn't live. We needed to throw them in the lake. They wouldn't have survived the winter anyway. I know he was my son, but he needed to go." Babbling on over and over about her son and the cold and the winter and the lake. I got a fairly good idea by the end of this that this woman had done something horrific in her past and couldn't deal with it, and it was just blubbering out because it was in her subconscious. It freaked me out a little bit, and I made note to not annoy that woman at any cost. I worked as a forest fire ranger for 3 years while in college. We often spent up to 20 days in the bush, moving campsites as we worked along the fire's edge. One night, I got up to urinate with a lantern. I could hear some branches and movement at the edge of our camp. Wild animals never really bothered me over the years. We had many encounters with bears, specifically that would try to get to our food. Me not thinking too much, I made a little yip to see if I could stir something into running off. I used the lantern and can see the reflection of 2 sets of eyes in the light bulbs, but not much else in the outline of the woods. They were spaced about 20 feet from each other. I turned into camp pretty damn quick and got the chainsaw we used for cutting trees and making camps. I ripped it wide open and scared those buggers off. It was a pack of wolves, and they had been curious enough to inspect our camp. I fully understand that the wolves would not have likely have ever thought about attacking our camp, especially with 4 adults there, but there was something incredibly unsettling about the way they stalk and sat there when caught. It was definitely the most unsettling experience that I have ever had in the woods. My roommate in college and I were watching a documentary about exorcisms in our living room one night. She was a neuroscience major, and she was explaining to me different scientific theories and explanations for what exorcisms could really be, other than paranormal possessions. Then, in the middle of her talking, a glass wine bottle that I placed on top of our fridge in the very back flew off the top of the refrigerator and slammed on the floor. It didn't break somehow. We got really spooked for a second, but then just let it go and kept watching the documentary and talking about how we really didn't believe in demons and whatnot. Then, our overhead fan with 3 individual light bulbs that weren't on a circuit, meaning they go out individually when each light bulb dies and not at the same time, all went out at the same time. We checked. They had all blown out for some reason. We were really freaked out after that, and left the apartment for the night. It may have just been weird coincidences, but pretty freaky nonetheless. How can a glass wine bottle just fly over a fridge and hit the floor? I still don't know how to explain that one away. I had a pretty bad experience while flying. It was New Zealand to Frankfurt, Germany, non-stop. It was a really long flight. I sat in the 3-seat window section with a couple. The woman gets airsick the moment she steps on the plane, so she started using the sick bags before we even shut the doors. And she did not stop, for over 20 hours. I got used to smelling her bile after a while, but couldn't get used to the sound of her retching. I broke out the bottle of Jack Daniels I bought in duty free and drank until I passed out. Of course, 23 hours allows for time to sleep off a bottle of Jack and wake up hungover. And when I did wake, I look over towards the window and there was that woman with the bag still at her face. I was outside checking on some turtles that were hibernating a few miles into the woods. As I'm finishing checking on the last turtle, I hear this growl and the entire woods goes quiet. I stand there for a second listening, and I can hear something moving through the woods behind me to my left. I get up, grab my walking stick, and pull out my knife and begin walking slowly to my truck. As I walk, I can hear it walking behind me slowly, working its way kind of to my side, where I can see that it's a huge wild dog. I get within about 100 feet of my truck when I hear it starting to run through the leaves. I turned around screaming as loudly as I could, swinging my walking stick, and it runs in the other direction but stops and watches me a few yards away. I keep walking to my car and it keeps following me right as I get close to my truck. I hit the alarm button on the keys and the wild dog runs off and I run to my car. While I drove out, I could see the dog in my rearview mirror following me, so I hit the gas to get out of there.